She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her hands trembled, her stomach groaned, and yet something far more painful than hunger would strike her that afternoon. On a sidewalk no one notices, under a sky that never looks down, she saw a face that should no longer exist, one that once called her mom. This is not just a story about poverty. It's about silence, betrayal, and the weight of truths buried too deep for too long. What happens when the person you thought had forgotten you is standing just a few steps away laughing like nothing ever happened? Watch until the end. Let this story speak to your heart. And if it does, follow the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Peachtree Street, and Alma Collins felt every ray pierce through the thin fabric of her faded Atlanta Hawks t-shirt. At 67, her hands trembled not from age, but from the hollow ache that had gnawed at her stomach for 3 days straight. The torn plastic bag she dragged behind her made a scraping sound against the sidewalk, a sound that had become the soundtrack of her invisible existence. She paused near a dumpster behind a Waffle House, the sweet smell of syrup and bacon fat making her dizzy with longing. Her reflection caught in a broken mirror someone had thrown away. Wild gray hair matted against her weathered face. Eyes that once commanded respect from 32nd graders now clouded with the resignation of someone the world had forgotten. She barely recognized herself anymore. The bustling midday crowd of downtown Atlanta flowed around her like she was a ghost. Business people in crisp suits, tourists with cameras, college students laughing into their phones. None of them saw her. She had become part of the urban landscape, as invisible as the fire hydrants and stop signs. But then across the busy street, something caught her attention through the haze of car exhaust and summer heat. The gleaming windows of Collins and Root, an upscale restaurant she'd noticed before but never dared approach. The kind of place where a single meal cost more than she saw in a month. Crystal chandeliers sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, and well-dressed patrons sat at white tablecloth tables, their laughter floating out each time the heavy oak door swung open. Alma pressed herself against a lamppost, watching the elegant dance of waiters in crisp uniforms serving dishes that looked like works of art. Her stomach cramped violently, reminding her of its emptiness, when suddenly the restaurant's front door burst open with the energy of celebration. A man in a pristine white chef's coat emerged, his face flushed with triumph and joy. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with strong hands that gestured animatedly as he spoke to the beautiful pregnant woman beside him. His laugh, rich and full of life, carried across the street like a melody from another world, and Alma's world stopped spinning. Those hands, that jawline, the way he tilted his head when he laughed, just slightly to the left, the confident stride, the way his shoulders moved when he walked. 27 years melted away in an instant, and she was suddenly back in her tiny kitchen in East Atlanta, watching a 10-year-old boy help her make Sunday pancakes, flour dusting his small hands as he giggled at his own jokes. "Caleb," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer she'd been silently reciting for decades. Her son, her beautiful, brilliant boy who used to trace letters in flour on her kitchen counter while she graded papers late into the night. The child who would curl up next to her on their second-hand couch, begging her to read just one more story. The boy who cried for her during thunderstorms and promised he'd never leave her side. The boy they told he was dead. Alma's knees buckled as the memories crashed over her like a tide. The fire, the lies, the psychiatric ward where they'd kept her for 8 years, insisting she was delusional, that she'd never had a son, that the trauma had made her imagine a child who never existed. The pills that made her forget her own name some days. The doctors who dismissed her pleas as the fantasies of a broken mind. But here he was, alive, successful, happy. He walked right past her lamppost, less than 10 feet away, his arm protectively around the pregnant woman's waist. Alma could see the wedding ring on his finger, the expensive watch, the confidence of a man who'd built something beautiful in the world. She opened her mouth to call his name, but no sound came. 27 years of silence had stolen her voice. He was so close she could smell his cologne, something expensive and warm that made her remember the Johnson's baby shampoo she used to rinse from his hair during bath time. She could see the scar above his left eyebrow where he'd fallen from his bike when he was 7, the same scar she'd kissed better 100 times. "If my mama could see this place," she heard him say to his wife, his southern drawl still carrying traces of the Atlanta neighborhoods where she'd raised him. She always said I'd do something special with my hands. Too bad she never got to see it happen. The words hit Alma like a physical blow. He thought she was dead. He'd been grieving her for 27 years, carrying the weight of her memory while she'd been carrying the weight of his absence. As Caleb and his wife disappeared into the crowd, Alma felt the last of her strength drain away. The heat, the hunger, the overwhelming flood of emotions. It all crashed down at once. Her vision blurred, her legs gave out, and she collapsed beside the lamppost, her torn bag spilling its meager contents onto the sidewalk. In her trembling hand, she clutched a yellowed newspaper clipping she'd kept folded in her pocket for years. The headline, barely readable now, "Local teacher Alma Collins presumed dead in house fire." Below it, a grainy photo of the charred remains of the small house where she'd raised her son, where they'd been a family, where their life together had been erased in a single night of flames and lies. As consciousness slipped away, Alma's last coherent thought was a question that had haunted her for nearly 3 decades. Who had wanted her gone badly enough to steal her son's love? And why? The sounds of the city faded to a distant hum as passers-by finally noticed the collapsed woman by the lamppost. But even in her unconscious state, Alma's fingers remained curled around that newspaper clipping, the only proof she had left that she'd once been real, once been loved, once been someone's whole world. The fluorescent lights of the downtown Atlanta emergency shelter buzzed like angry wasps above Alma's head as she slowly regained consciousness. The smell hit her first, disinfectant mixed with unwashed bodies and the lingering scent of donated clothing that had seen too many owners. Her mouth felt like cotton, and every muscle in her body ached from collapsing on the concrete. "Easy there, honey," came a gentle voice beside her. A young woman with kind eyes and a volunteer badge reading Maria was adjusting a thin blanket around Alma's shoulders. "You've been out for about 2 hours. EMTs checked you over. Just dehydration and exhaustion. Nothing a good meal and some rest won't fix." Alma tried to sit up, her head spinning. Around her, the shelter was a maze of cots and folding chairs, filled with Atlanta's forgotten souls. An elderly black man played chess with himself in the corner, muttering strategies under his breath. A young mother rocked a crying baby, while 2 toddlers clung to her legs. The sounds of quiet conversations, coughing, and the occasional argument over territory created a symphony of survival. "Here," Maria said, pressing a styrofoam bowl into Alma's hands. The soup was thin, more broth than substance, but it was warm and it was free. "The kitchen closes in an hour, so you're lucky we saved you some." As Alma sipped the watery chicken broth, she felt something crinkle against her chest. Her hand flew to her shirt pocket. The newspaper clipping was still there, along with something else. Her fingers found the edge of an envelope, yellowed with age and worn from countless handlings. Her heart skipped as she pulled it out. Caleb Collins was written across the front in her own careful handwriting. The ink faded but still legible. It was one of dozens of letters she'd written over the years but never had the courage to send. This one was dated 3 years ago, written during one of her darker nights when the loneliness threatened to swallow her whole. She remembered writing it in the 24-hour Waffle House on Memorial Drive, using napkins to dry her tears as she poured out her heart to the son who believed she was dead. In it, she'd told him about watching his high school graduation from across the street, hidden behind a tree. About following news of his culinary school achievements in old newspapers she'd find in the library. About the dreams she still had where he was 10 years old and needed her to check for monsters under his bed. "You all right, sweetheart?" Maria asked, noticing how Alma clutched the envelope to her chest like a lifeline. "My son," Alma whispered, her voice barely audible above the shelter's ambient noise. "I saw my son today." Maria's expression softened with the practiced compassion of someone who'd heard countless heartbreaking stories. "That's wonderful. Is he looking for you?" Alma almost laughed at the cruel irony. "He thinks I'm dead." Before Maria could respond, 2 women at a nearby table began talking in excited whispers. Alma's attention was drawn to their conversation, despite herself. "Did you see Channel 5 this morning?" the younger woman was saying, her voice carrying across the room. "That chef from Collins and Root is going to be on Atlanta Eats tomorrow night. They're doing some big feature on him." "Lord, that boy can cook," her companion replied. "My daughter works downtown. Says his restaurant's booked solid for months. Started from nothing too, I heard. Parents died when he was young." Alma's soup bowl slipped from her trembling hands, clattering to the floor and splashing the thin broth across her shoes. The lies had taken root so deep that even strangers believed them. Even her son believed them. "I need to go," she said suddenly, struggling to her feet despite Maria's protests. "Ma'am, it's almost 9 p.m. You should stay the night. Get some real rest." But Alma was already moving toward the door, the letter still clutched in her fist. She had to see him again. She had to be sure it was really him, that she hadn't imagined their encounter in some hunger-induced hallucination. Tomorrow night, Channel 5. She'd find a way to watch, even if she had to press her face against the window of every electronic store in Atlanta. As she pushed through the shelter's heavy glass doors into the humid Georgia night, Alma made a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was going to find a way to reach him. After 27 years of silence, of being told she was crazy, of being erased from her own son's life, she was going to fight back. The letter in her hand felt warm with possibility. Maybe it was time to finally send it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Peachtree Street as Alma made her way toward the gleaming facade of Collins and Root. She'd walked for over an hour from the shelter, her feet aching in shoes held together with duct tape, but determination propelled her forward. In her pocket, the letter to Caleb felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. The restaurant looked even more impressive in daylight. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed an interior that spoke of success and refinement. Exposed brick walls adorned with modern art, Edison bulb chandeliers casting warm light over reclaimed wood tables, and an open kitchen where she could see chefs in pristine white coats moving with choreographed precision. Alma positioned herself across the street, partially hidden behind a bus stop shelter, and waited. Her stomach gnawed at itself, but she ignored the hunger. She'd survived worse. At 10:30 a.m., the front door opened, and there he was. Caleb stepped out into the Atlanta sunshine, and Alma's breath caught in her throat. In daylight, the resemblance was undeniable. He had her father's strong jaw, her own stubborn chin, and those same expressive hands that had once reached for her when nightmares woke him. But he was a man now, confident and successful, wearing his achievements like armor. The pregnant woman, Sarah, she remembered hearing him call her, emerged beside him, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. She was beautiful in that effortless way some women possessed, with honey blonde hair and the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. Alma felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Jealousy, gratitude. This woman got to love her son, got to build a family with him, got to be part of the life that should have been hers. "The interview went amazing," Sarah was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the empty street. "Channel 5 is going to make you Atlanta's favorite chef." Caleb laughed, that rich sound that transported Alma back 27 years. "If my mama could see this place," he said, gesturing toward the restaurant with obvious pride. "She always believed I was destined for something special. Said these hands were made for creating, not destroying." He held up his hands, studying them with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "Too bad she died without seeing what I built. Sometimes I cook her favorite cornbread just to feel close to her memory." The words hit Alma like a physical blow. Her cornbread recipe, the one she'd taught him when he was 8, letting him measure the cornmeal while she mixed the buttermilk. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "She would be so proud," Sarah said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek. "And she'd love knowing there's going to be a grandchild." "Yeah," Caleb replied, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I could remember more about her. The fire took everything. Photos, memories, even her voice sometimes gets fuzzy in my head." Alma took a step forward, her body moving without conscious thought. She was going to cross that street, going to walk up to him and say his name, going to end 27 years of separation right here on this sidewalk. But just as she stepped off the curb, a police cruiser rounded the corner, moving slowly down Peachtree Street. Terror froze her blood. The psych ward. The years of being told she was delusional. The medications that made her forget her own name. If they took her now, if they locked her away again, she might never get another chance to reach him. She ducked back behind the bus shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs as the cruiser passed. When she looked up again, Caleb and Sarah were getting into a silver BMW, his hand gentle on her back as he helped her into the passenger seat. As the car pulled away, Alma fumbled in her pocket for the letter, but her fingers found something else instead. A photograph torn down the middle. She pulled it out with shaking hands. It was old and faded, showing a young Caleb, maybe 5 years old, sitting on someone's lap. But the other half of the photo, the part that would show whose lap he occupied, was missing. She stared at the jagged edge where the photo had been ripped, her mind racing. She'd kept this fragment for years, but she couldn't remember having the other half. Who had torn it? And more importantly, who had the missing piece? The morning sun climbed higher as Alma stood alone on the sidewalk, clutching half a memory and a letter she still didn't have the courage to send. But something had changed in those few minutes of watching her son. She wasn't just a broken woman clinging to the past anymore. She was a mother whose child needed to know the truth. The Carnegie Branch Library on Carnegie Way smelled like old books and broken dreams, a scent Alma had grown to love during her years of hiding in plain sight among Atlanta's forgotten corners. She discovered that libraries were sanctuaries where homeless people could exist without being hassled, where she could disappear into the stacks and pretend she belonged somewhere. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the microfilm machine, searching through archived copies of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution from 1995. The years blurred together on the screen, headlines about the Olympics coming to Atlanta, political scandals, sports victories, until she found what she was looking for. There, on page 3 of the Metro section, dated September 15, 1995, local pastor gains custody after tragic loss. The photograph made her stomach lurch. Pastor Luther Collins stood outside the Fulton County Courthouse, his hand resting possessively on 10-year-old Caleb's shoulder. Her ex-husband looked exactly as she remembered, tall, imposing, with that practiced expression of righteous grief he'd perfected during their marriage. Caleb stood beside him, small and lost, his eyes red from crying. The article was brief, but devastating. Following the tragic death of his wife Alma in a house fire, Pastor Luther Collins of New Hope Baptist Church has been granted full custody of his son Caleb. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," Pastor Collins said, "but he also provides. This boy will be raised in the light of his love, free from the darkness that claimed his mother." Darkness that claimed his mother. Alma's hands shook as she printed the article. Even then, Luther had been spinning the narrative, painting her as somehow responsible for her own supposed death. But she knew better. She remembered the fight they'd had the night before the fire. She remembered Luther's rage when she'd threatened to leave him, to take Caleb away from his increasingly fanatical congregation. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the library windows when Alma made her decision. She had to go to New Hope Baptist Church. She had to see if Luther was still there, still preaching his poison to unsuspecting souls. The church sat on Auburn Avenue like a wound that had never healed properly. The red brick building looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier, with peeling paint on the window frames and weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. But the sign out front still bore Luther's name, Pastor Luther Collins, shepherding souls since 1987. Alma circled the building twice before finding the nerve to approach. The basement entrance was unlocked. It always had been. Luther's one concession to charity was keeping the church open for those who needed shelter. She slipped inside, her footsteps echoing in the familiar corridors that still smelled of pine sol and religious fervor. Voices drifted from Luther's office upstairs. She crept closer, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they'd hear it. Through a crack in the door she could see her ex-husband's back. He'd aged. His hair was completely gray now, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his voice still carried that same commanding authority that had once made her feel so small. "I told you, Brother Marcus," Luther was saying to someone Alma couldn't see. "That woman is buried and gone. Dead as dead gets. Ain't no point in folks stirring up old graves." "But Pastor," came another voice, younger and uncertain, "someone's been asking questions about the fire, about what really happened to Sister Alma." Alma's blood turned to ice. Someone else was investigating? Someone else knew the truth wasn't as simple as Luther had made it seem? "Don't matter what nobody asks." Luther's voice turned hard, dangerous. "The Lord's business is the Lord's business. That woman got what was coming to her, and her boy is better off without her poison in his life." The casual cruelty in his voice made Alma's knees buckle. She steadied herself against the wall, fighting the urge to burst through that door and confront him. But she wasn't strong enough yet. She wasn't ready. That evening, back in the relative safety of the shelter, Alma rummaged through her few possessions stored in a locker the staff let her use. At the bottom of a plastic bag, beneath her extra clothes and a worn Bible, her fingers found what she'd almost forgotten about, an envelope. sealed, and never opened. Inside was a check for $10,000, dated September 20th, 1995, 5 days after the newspaper article. It was signed by Luther Collins, and attached to it was a yellow post-it note, the adhesive long since dried. For disappearing. Don't make me ask twice. Alma stared at the check until her vision blurred. He'd paid someone to make her disappear. But who? And why had they kept the check instead of cashing it? Sarah Collins Matthews stood in the pristine kitchen of their Buckhead home, surrounded by cookbooks and printed articles about her husband's rise to culinary fame. She'd been working on a biographical piece for Atlanta magazine about Caleb's journey from orphaned child to celebrated chef. But the more she dug into his past, the more questions arose. The official story was simple enough. Parents died in a house fire when he was 10, raised by his pastor grandfather until he aged out of the system at 18, worked his way through culinary school, built his restaurant empire from nothing. It was the kind of American dream narrative that magazines loved. But Sarah was a former investigative journalist, and something about the neat, tidy timeline felt wrong. She spread the documents across their marble countertop. Death certificates, custody records, newspaper clippings. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Alma Collins died in a house fire on September 10, 1995. But there were inconsistencies. The fire report mentioned a body too badly burned for positive identification. The death certificate was signed by a doctor who'd lost his license 3 years later for falsifying documents. And strangest of all, there were no medical records for Alma Collins at any Atlanta hospital before 1995. "Babe, you're obsessing again," Caleb said, entering the kitchen with that easy smile that had first made her fall in love with him. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her growing belly. "The baby doesn't need all this stress." "I'm just trying to get the facts straight," Sarah replied, leaning back against his chest. "Your mother's story. There are gaps, Caleb. Important ones." She felt him stiffen behind her. "What kind of gaps?" Before she could answer, their housekeeper Maria knocked on the kitchen door. "Mr. Caleb, there's an envelope for you. No return address. Someone left it by the front gate." Caleb frowned as he took the manila envelope, his name written in careful block letters across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made his face go pale. "You don't know the woman who gave birth to you. Ask your wife to stop digging, or you'll learn truths that will destroy everything you think you know about your past." Sarah snatched the letter from his trembling hands. "Caleb, this proves it. Someone is trying to hide something about your mother. Or someone's playing a sick joke," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sarah, please let it go. My parents are dead. I've made peace with that." But Sarah couldn't let it go. That afternoon, while Caleb was at the restaurant, she drove to the address listed on Alma's death certificate, a modest house in East Atlanta that had been rebuilt after the fire. The current residents, an elderly black couple, invited her in for sweet tea and stories about the neighborhood's history. "Oh yes, we remember the Collins family," Mrs. Washington said, settling into her recliner. "Sweet little boy that Caleb was. Always polite, always hungry. His mama used to walk him to school every morning singing the prettiest songs." "What was she like?" Sarah asked, her recorder app running on her phone. "Alma? Lord, that woman could sing like an angel. Every Sunday evening she'd sit on her front porch with that boy, teaching him old hymns and lullabies. Had the most beautiful voice. You could hear her 3 blocks away." Sarah's heart began to race. "Do you remember any of the songs?" Mrs. Washington's eyes lit up. "Course I do. She loved that old spiritual, 'Swing Low, Sweet Chariot.' But she had her own little version she'd sing to Caleb. Changed the words to make it about protecting children. Went something like, 'Sleep now, my sweet child, Mama's watching over you.'" The world tilted around Sarah. That song. She'd heard Caleb humming it just last week while he prepared dinner. The same melody he'd been unconsciously singing to her belly when he thought she was asleep. He'd told her it was just something that came to him, a tune that made him feel peaceful. "Mrs. Washington," Sarah said, her voice barely steady, "are you absolutely certain Alma Collins died in that fire?" The elderly woman exchanged a meaningful look with her husband. "Honey," she said carefully, "there's been folks around here wondering about that for near 30 years. That fire was mighty convenient timing, coming right after all that trouble between her and that preacher husband of hers." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that makes a woman pack a suitcase and hide it under her bed," Mr. Washington said quietly. The kind that makes her ask her neighbors to watch out for her boy if something happens to her. Sarah left the Washington house with her hands shaking and her mind racing. When she got home, she went straight to Caleb's study and pulled out the box of mementos he'd saved from his childhood, the few things that had survived the fire. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a photograph torn down the middle. It showed a young Caleb sitting on someone's lap, but the other person had been cut out of the picture. As she held the photograph up to the light, Sarah noticed something she'd missed before. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "My sweet boy and his guardian angel, 1992. Guardian angel, not mother. As if whoever wrote this was describing themselves from the outside, watching over Caleb but unable to claim him. Sarah sank into Caleb's leather chair, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the torn photograph. Everything they thought they knew was a lie. But if Alma Collins hadn't died in that fire, where was she now? Sarah's hands trembled as she carried the dusty box down from Pastor Luther Collins' attic. The old man had been surprisingly cooperative when she'd called, claiming to be working on a tribute piece about Caleb's late mother for the restaurant's upcoming anniversary. "Come on by, child," he'd said in that smooth preacher voice. "I've got some things that might help with your story." The pastor's house on the outskirts of Decatur felt frozen in time. Wood-paneled walls covered with faded religious artwork, the smell of old coffee and mothballs hanging in the air. Luther himself looked frailer than she'd expected, his once commanding presence diminished by age and what appeared to be the early stages of dementia. Alma was a troubled woman, he'd said, while leading her to the attic. The Lord called her home before she could corrupt that boy any further. But I kept some things. Thought maybe one day Caleb would want to remember the good times. Now, sitting in her car outside the pastor's house, Sarah opened the box with mounting anticipation. Inside were typical childhood artifacts: report cards, a few drawings, a small stuffed elephant worn bald from hugging. But at the bottom, wrapped in an old church bulletin, she found something that made her heart race: a Sony Handycam from the 1990s, along with a shoebox full of high-8 tapes. She drove straight to a video transfer shop in Little 5 Points, her mind spinning with possibilities. The technician, a Pierced college student named Jake, promised to digitize the tapes within an hour. Sarah paced the store's narrow aisles, her pregnancy making her back ache but unable to sit still. "Ma'am," Jake called from behind the counter, "you need to see this." The first tape was innocent enough: Caleb's 7th birthday party, the little boy blowing out candles while adults sang in the background. But as the tapes progressed chronologically, Sarah began to notice troubling details. In several shots, Alma Collins appeared with bruises on her arms, shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. The woman was beautiful but fragile, like a bird with clipped wings. Fast forward to September 1995, Sarah instructed, her journalist instincts kicking in. The image that appeared on the screen made her gasp. It was shaky footage, clearly shot from across the street, showing the Collins house engulfed in flames. Fire trucks, police cars, neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. And there, being helped from the burning building by 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, was a woman who was very much alive. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered. "Is that—" "Keep recording," Sarah said, her voice tight with shock. The camera followed the woman, unmistakably Alma Collins, as she was led to an ambulance. She was conscious, talking to the EMTs, looking around frantically. Her mouth formed one word over and over: "Caleb, Caleb, Caleb." But then something strange happened. A woman in a nurse's uniform approached the ambulance, spoke briefly to the EMTs, and suddenly Alma was being sedated. The last clear shot showed her being loaded into the ambulance, conscious but struggling against the restraints. "Who the hell was filming this?" Sarah whispered. Jake enhanced the audio, and they could hear a man's voice behind the camera. "Phase 1 complete. The boy thinks she's dead. Phase 2 starts tomorrow." Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random house fire. It was an orchestrated kidnapping disguised as a tragedy. Someone had planned to separate Alma from her son, and they'd documented their crime. She bought copies of everything and drove home in a daze. Caleb was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming that same lullaby she now knew belonged to his supposedly dead mother. She watched him move around their kitchen with fluid grace, completely unaware that his entire life had been built on a lie. "How was your research today?" he asked without turning around, dicing onions with professional precision. Sarah set the box of tapes on the counter between them. Caleb, I need you to sit down. Can it wait? The risotto needs constant attention and your mother didn't die in the fire. The knife slipped from Caleb's fingers, clattering to the floor. He turned slowly, his face pale. What did you say? I have video footage. She survived, Caleb. She was taken away in an ambulance, alive and conscious. Someone staged her death. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the bubbling of the risotto burning on the stove. Then Caleb sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. That's impossible, he whispered. I saw the funeral. I threw dirt on her casket. Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. Whose funeral did you attend, Caleb? Because it wasn't your mother's. The truth hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Somewhere in Atlanta, Alma Collins was still alive, still believing her son thought she was dead, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep them apart. The Fox Theater's grand lobby glittered under crystal chandeliers as Atlanta's culinary elite gathered for the annual Georgia Restaurant Association's awards gala. Caleb stood near the red carpet in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, Sarah radiant beside him in a midnight blue gown that accommodated her growing belly. Flashbulbs popped as photographers captured Atlanta's rising star chef, but Caleb's smile felt frozen on his face. For 3 days, he'd been wrestling with Sarah's revelation. The video footage played on repeat in his mind. His mother, alive, being taken away while he grieved for a ghost. He'd barely slept, barely eaten, mechanically going through the motions at the restaurant while his world crumbled around him. You ready for this? Sarah whispered, squeezing his arm as they approached the entrance. Caleb nodded, though ready was the last thing he felt. Tonight he was being honored as Atlanta's Young Chef of the Year, a recognition that should have been the pinnacle of his career. Instead, it felt like a hollow mockery built on 27 years of lies. Inside the theater, the crowd was a sea of formal wear and champagne glasses. Caleb recognized faces from the Atlanta food scene, restaurant owners, food critics, fellow chefs who'd become friends and rivals. They all knew his story, the orphaned boy who'd risen from tragedy to triumph. None of them knew the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced from the stage, please welcome our Young Chef of the Year, Caleb Collins. Applause thundered through the theater as Caleb made his way to the stage, each step feeling like he was walking through quicksand. He gripped the podium, looking out at the sea of expectant faces, and opened his mouth to deliver the speech he'd prepared about perseverance and following dreams. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the back of the theater, where a commotion was quietly unfolding. Security guards were gently but firmly trying to escort someone out, a homeless woman who'd somehow slipped past the checkpoints. She was small, frail, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been donated multiple times over. Her gray hair hung in tangled wisps around a face that was gaunt with hunger and hardship, and she was staring directly at him with eyes he recognized from his dreams. Mama? The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, amplified by the podium microphone and carrying to every corner of the silent theater. The woman stopped struggling against the security guards. Slowly, she reached into her torn coat pocket and pulled out something that made Caleb's knees buckle. A photograph torn down the middle showing half of his 5-year-old self sitting on someone's lap. He had the other half at home. Sarah had orchestrated this. Somehow she'd found his mother and brought her here, to this moment, in front of all these people. The theater was dead silent now. 800 of Atlanta's most influential residents watching the drama unfold. Alma Collins took a step forward and her voice, cracked with years of silence, carried clearly through the theater's perfect acoustics. My sweet boy, I never died. I never left you by choice. The statement hit the audience like a physical wave. Gasps echoed through the theater, followed by the rapid clicking of phone cameras as people began recording what they sensed was an extraordinary moment. Caleb stared down at the woman who claimed to be his mother, his mind reeling. She looked nothing like the vibrant, laughing woman from his childhood memories. This was a broken person, hollowed out by decades of loss and suffering. But her eyes, those were his mother's eyes, filled with love and pain and desperate hope. I wrote you letters, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Hundreds of letters. I watched you graduate. I watched you succeed. I've been living on these streets for 27 years, believing you thought I was dead. The silence stretched like a taut wire until Caleb finally found his voice. "If you're really my mother," he said, his words echoing through the theater, "then sing me the song, the one from the porch." Without hesitation, Alma's voice rose in the familiar melody. "Sleep now, my sweet child, Mama's watching over you. Sleep now, my sweet child. Angels guard you through and through." It was the lullaby he'd been humming unconsciously for years, the melody that brought him peace when nothing else could, the song his dead mother had sung to him on countless evenings, rocking on their front porch while the Georgia sun set behind them. Caleb's carefully constructed world shattered in that moment. The applause, the award, the recognition, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the broken woman standing in the back of the theater, the woman who'd been erased from his life while he built a career on the foundation of her supposed death. He stepped away from the podium, away from the spotlight, away from everything he thought he knew about himself. And he walked out of the theater, leaving his mother standing alone under the crystal chandeliers, watched by 800 strangers who'd just witnessed Atlanta's golden boy discover his life was built on lies. The sterile smell of Grady Hospital's cardiac wing filled Caleb's nostrils as he sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his mother's bed. 3 days had passed since the scene at the Fox Theater. 3 days since Alma had collapsed from the overwhelming shock of finally being acknowledged by the son she'd lost decades ago. The doctors said it was exhaustion, malnutrition, and a heart condition that had gone untreated for years. Caleb hadn't left the hospital since she was admitted. He studied her sleeping face, trying to reconcile this fragile woman with the vibrant mother of his memories. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair thin and gray, her hands bearing the calluses and scars of someone who'd survived on the streets. But when she slept, when the worry lines softened, he could see glimpses of the woman who'd read him bedtime stories and taught him to make cornbread from scratch. In his lap, he held one of the letters Sarah had found in Alma's meager possessions, one of dozens she'd written but never sent. The envelope was yellowed with age, dated April 15, 2018, 3 years ago. His name was written across the front in careful cursive, the same handwriting that had helped him with homework and left encouraging notes in his lunchbox. With trembling fingers, he opened it and began to read. "My dearest Caleb, today would have been your 33rd birthday. I stood outside the Publix on Ponce de Leon and watched through the window as they announced your restaurant's opening on the news. I cried right there in the parking lot, not from sadness but from pride. You've become everything I dreamed you could be. I know you think I'm dead. I know they told you I abandoned you. But I want you to know that not a single day has passed that I haven't thought about you, prayed for you, loved you from whatever distance this cruel world has put between us. If you ever read this, know that you are the best thing I ever did with my life. Love always. Your mama who never stopped believing." Tears blurred his vision as he carefully folded the letter. How many birthdays had she spent watching him from afar? How many achievements had she celebrated alone, unable to share in the joy she'd helped create? "You came back," came a whisper from the bed. Caleb looked up to find Alma's eyes open, studying his face with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. "I'm sorry I ran," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was scared, confused. My whole life just fell apart in that theater." Alma struggled to sit up, and Caleb gently helped her, adjusting her pillows. "I never blamed you for believing I was dead," she said. "They made sure you had every reason to believe it." "Who?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Your father, the pastor, the nurse from the church who sedated me that night. They wanted me gone, wanted you raised in their version of righteousness, free from my corrupting influence." Her voice carried decades of bitterness. "They locked me away for 8 years in a psychiatric facility, told everyone I was delusional, that I'd made up having a son. By the time I got out, you'd already graduated high school, already disappeared into your new life." Caleb reached for her hand, shocked by how small and frail it felt in his own. "Why didn't you try to find me sooner?" "I did try," Alma whispered. "But what was I going to say? I was a homeless woman with a history of mental illness, claiming to be the mother of Atlanta's rising star chef. Who would have believed me? I convinced myself you were better off thinking I was dead than knowing the truth about what happened to me." They sat in silence for a while, 27 years of separation hanging between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Finally, Caleb stood and walked to the small table by the window where he'd set a covered plate. "I brought you something," he said, lifting the cover to reveal a simple meal, perfectly cooked cornbread, green beans seasoned with bacon, and mashed potatoes with a well of butter in the center. Your recipe, the one you taught me when I was 8. Alma's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the meal, the same comfort food she'd made for him whenever he was sick or sad or scared. You remembered. I remember everything, Caleb said, sitting back down and placing the fork in her trembling hand. The way you hummed while you cooked, how you'd let me lick the spoon when you made cornbread batter, the stories you'd tell me about my grandmother's garden. As Alma took her first bite, Caleb pulled out a cloth napkin he'd brought from the restaurant. On it, in careful script, he'd embroidered a single word. Mama. I had them make this at the restaurant, he said. Your place at the table whenever you're ready. For the first time in 27 years, Alma Collins smiled, really smiled. And for a moment, Caleb could see the woman who'd raised him, who'd believed in him, who'd never stopped loving him despite everything that had been stolen from them. Sometimes the people we think have forgotten us are the ones still carrying our memory in silence. And sometimes the ones we thought we lost forever were never that far. We just stopped looking in the right direction. What would you have done if you were in her place? Would you have had the strength to forgive, to love from the shadows, to wait without promises? This story is a mirror. It asks us what kind of legacy we leave when our voice is taken, when truth is buried, and love must survive in secret. How many moments have passed us by because we chose pride over reconciliation? How many people are still waiting for a word, a gesture, a sign that they were never truly forgotten? If this story touched something deep inside you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Give this video a like to support our work, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from and what would you have done in the end?